Our next presenter, Theanos Thrax, is an independent polymath scholar and priest associated with studies in religion, identity orientation, marginalization, human rights, change-oriented social engagement, and more recently, involvement in politics. As polytheist, animist, clergy, and spirit worker, they provide professional religious support services to organizations, individuals, and underrepresented identity groups, including prison chaplaincy programs and suicide prevention outreach. In addition to academic and religious work, Theanos provides educational support and consultation to elected offices, including policy advisement in the development of human rights and diversity-related legislation. Active in identity representation areas ranging from polytheistic religion to disability and neurodiversity to gender and culture, they also oversee, as an extension of their temple, a serpent sanctuary, which provides permanent housing and care following rescue and rehabilitation services for abandoned, neglected, and abused animals, occasionally supporting wildlife rescue calls across a wide range of species in New England. When not working in these areas, they find time as a visual artist, novelist, and recording artist with a group presently spread between the United States and Japan. Since 2020, they have returned to providing pro bono mental health consultation, education, and advocacy services during the global pandemic, especially related to expanding trauma awareness and identity consideration in recovery, management, and treatment. And so with that, I'll hand over to my good friend, Theanos Thrax.
Thank you, Edward. I am somewhat famous for not divulging very much or going into very much about my own religious practices as a devotional polytheist, as an animist, in part because they are more private. I have a temple, I have members of that, but within my contributions to the greater polytheist dialogue and the greater polytheist movement, I have focused more on identifying areas of the dialogue that I see being left out, as in my last few minutes of contribution with the earlier panel today, where place was being left out. And this led me to inadvertently discovering a major failing in our dialogue, an area that had simply not been addressed, and that is theistic orientation of identity, which has become kind of my flagship academic contribution. And it is specifically an answer to the problem of the distinction between one's theistic identity and one's religious identity, because these are distinct things. One's religious orientation of identity informs their practices, their beliefs, their affiliations, and their membership. But one can be a member of, or practitioner of, or even devotee of a religion without necessarily having the theistic orientations that that religion states or describes. And so in exploring this over the last 10 or 15 years, it was Dr. Edward Butler who pointed out to me once, while I was frustrated with some people in dialogue, that I was getting frustrated at them for not understanding a concept that I had not yet published the book on. And that led me to formally writing up what I'll now be giving a short presentation on. And that is the polytheistic orientation of identity, which is part of a series on theistic orientation of identity. But to begin, just briefly introducing what identity is, because it's a word that we talk a lot about. And since I'm all about distinctions, it's important to note that, you know, identity means something different when we're talking about identity within cultural anthropology, or identity within philosophy, or identity within theology. So I'm coming out of the social sciences, sociology, psychology, and a lot of specifically identity topics related to contemporary areas such as human rights in gender discrimination and sexuality. So when I'm referencing identity without going into big, heady academic dynamics around it, identity of self, self-concept, these are the characteristics, the things that make me who I am and you who you are. And it is not a singular thing, but in keeping with the theme of pluralism and polycentrality, identity is a composition of characteristics that each of us has. And every person, actually, and that's a key piece here, is that identity is the currency of personhood. Personhood is the requisite dynamic for the attribution of rights, collectively or individually. And identity is how we define, understand, and know personhood in self or others. And it is made up of a composite of different characteristics. For example, everybody has gender identity. Everybody has sexual identity. Everybody has, in that same manner, some form of theistic orientation of identity. And the reason that I began these studies was specifically because I saw again and again and again, cross-culturally and in interfaith dialogues, conflicts arising between persons who were fighting about who belonged or did not belong within a certain religious identity group or within a certain conversation, who had the right to attend a ritual, who had the right to weigh in or hold strong opinions on certain subjects, either socially, ritually, theologically. And so I sort of treat that conflict as the original problem that I was seeking to bring some degree of clarity to, because to me, these things are as self-evident as, you know, looking out at the sky to see what the weather is currently doing. I see these things quite clearly. So then briefly, I want to define orientation, because again, that's one of those terms that we throw around a lot, especially in identity studies, but it rarely gets well defined. And so I'm just basing my usage of it on the literal, you know, to orient oneself is to identify the path of the sun in the literal sense. And the purpose of orientation, if you just picture a physical, actual directional compass, is that when we are attempting to navigate through the world, through the physical world, we need to be able to identify fixed cardinal directions or fixed cardinal points so that we can then determine our placement and our relative relationship to those points. And so the obvious example there is if you get lost hiking or mountain climbing, find not just the placement of the sun, but its trajectory through the sky. And then from there, you can infer your relative placement with regard to the other directions. And then if you have any idea of where you are in the world, presumably navigate somewhat better than if you didn't know those things. And so the idea of orientation is predicated upon certain fixed points, certain cardinal directions or cardinal points that between which every other thing exists. And those four do not define everything, but between each of them is an infinite array of additional points of navigation. How this relates to identity, and how this relates to theistic identity specifically. We all have met people, for example, who are grew up culturally Catholic and go to a Catholic church. They have Catholic weddings, they have Catholic baptisms and christenings for their children, etc. But they don't appear to be, theistically speaking, really all that theistic at all. Oftentimes you will find a high degree of atheism, or you will find a high degree of henotheism within certain currents. And this is where that distinction between religious orientation of identity and theistic orientation of identity comes in. And the argument has been made and continues to be made that these distinctions don't really matter. And to that, I actually just reference an entirely different area of identity, that being sexual orientation and gender orientation. If a person is bisexual, if their sexual orientation of identity is bisexual, they are not less bisexual if they are in a relationship with somebody of their same sex. That does not make them homosexual. They are still bisexual. Their sexual orientation is not contingent upon their practices or their present affiliations or membership relationships. Their identity is understood to be intrinsic. And how do we know it? Because they told us. And that is part of how agency dynamic works within personhood and identity. Similarly, somebody who is homosexual but living in a part of the world where it is a potential death sentence to be identified that way publicly is not less homosexual if they have an arrangement of domestic or romantic life that is apparently heterosexual or procreative in nature, because survival necessity also does not negate identity. The identity is intrinsic and held throughout. That does not absolve the dynamics of inhumanity and genocides that exist in that place, so not an exoneration there at all, but rather simply to state that the sexual orientation of identity does not change simply because the relationships presently or publicly observable do not align with it as would be popularly understood, because orientations of identity are complicated. Theistic orientation is the same. So we can be within a religious body of ritual or fellowship or fraternal practice, which is not in alignment with our present theistic orientations of identity. But I'll be returning to that a little bit more later. I want to move on to defining. So I've defined identity, I've defined orientation, and I've defined identity orientation. Moving specifically into how I am defining theistic orientation in formal language, I'll actually read it out loud. Theistic orientation describes the manner in which an individual's identity is formed, influenced, and or derived from their affirmed or absent, rejected relationship to theistic considerations and beings, or in short, gods. For any person who holds such a fundamental affirmation, not at secular, humanistic, or religious affiliation level, but from a place of deep and intrinsic theistic paradigm regarding how everything in the cosmos is composed, identity, being a thing composed within said cosmos, is by necessity influenced or formed by these paradigms, which supply a foundation for understandings and experience, not only of self, but of all the world and of reality, and how each and all of these interrelates. In this sense, theistic orientation paradigms are relationally defining and categorically explicit to the formation of the identity of personhood. The subject of one's theistic orientation is not about religious affiliations, practices, or membership. Theistic orientation is the level of identity of self which is formed by some relative affirmation or rejection, with or without religious regard, of gods as beings possessing of genuine existence, independent of humans. In a moment, I'll be getting to defining my proposal for the 4 cardinal points of the theistic orientation compass. And so for this, if I were PowerPoint savvy, I would do a screen share and show you a cool compass, but I don't have one and I'm not. So just use your imagination and picture a compass. Thankfully, it's a circle with 4 points on it. So we've all seen one in the corner of every map. You can picture the 4 cardinal points that I am going to be elaborating on as being corresponding to north, east, south, and west. And a quick note in preamble here is that while there's no comprehensive study or survey at this time, give me time on that. It is a little bit complicated, but the expectation moving forward is that the current global majority of theistic orientations of identity is atheistic. And that is important to note because as many of the discussions, both in the first portion of our conference today during the initial dialogue panel, and also in both of the introduced papers that I'm following here, we've talked about the issue of secular majority and monotheistic influence and impactfulness upon polytheist discourse and polytheist identity at large as a major hindrance. And one of the things that is glaringly obvious to anybody that immerses themselves in my work is that I don't consider monotheistic identity to be one of the forms of theistic orientation of identity at all. I do explain that at length in the hundreds and hundreds of pages that I've written on this, but the primary thing is that I reframe monotheistic identity as nominal monotheism. It is in name only monotheistic, because in order for it to exist at all in any framework, it needs to fundamentally redefine deity or theism in a manner that is rejective of everybody else. And therefore, it is in most true to form in interpretation, it is atheism. However, individual nominal monotheists may be polytheists if they are Catholic. They may be henotheists if they are coming from certain currents of Judaism, for example. And so I just wanted to name that monotheism is not one of these four at all. Most of what we call monotheism falls within the cardinal position at the north section, which is atheistic orientation of identity, which again is expected to make up the current majority of the world. That has clearly not always been the case. It is at present. Before I define each, the proposed four are atheistic, henotheistic, polytheistic, and a term that will be unfamiliar to most here, paratheistic. These correspond, and don't read into the correspondences here at all. It doesn't mean anything. It's just a visual to north, east, south, and west. In this compass, atheism is to the north, henotheism to the east, polytheism to the south, and paratheism to the west. And the reason there is a relational polarity that exists between them. So there is a specific polarity between the north and the south cardinals and the east and the west cardinals, which are why they were chosen as my four proposed cardinals. And again, these are not comprehensive. There are an infinite number of theistic orientations of identity, just as we could list off dozens of genders and dozens of sexual orientations of identity. This is just for the purposes of having a tool, having a navigational device in order to determine relative position. So in defining them, atheistic orientation of identity is the absence and categorical rejection of any affirmation with religious regard of gods as beings possessing of genuine existence, independence of humans, and carries a constitutive role for the active rejections therein, and describes one whose identity and subsequent paradigms are influentially formed by this. A lot of this language will get repetitive, so I'll speed through it because it's formal language for each one. Henotheistic orientation of identity holds some level of exclusionary or serial exclusionary relational affirmation with religious regard of at least some gods, who exist as genuine beings independent of human consciousness, with a restrictive theistic body, e.g., one or some small number of gods, and describes one whose identity and subsequent paradigms are influentially formed by this, without overt denial, challenge, or erasure of other theistic expressions. Polytheistic orientation of identity, arguably the easiest to define, holds a relational affirmation with religious regard of many gods who exist as genuine beings independent of human consciousness, and describes one whose identity and subsequent paradigms are influentially formed by this. A polytheist is one whose identity level affirmation of many gods dramatically informs the bounds of their understanding of personhood and cosmos as considered in self and others. Finally, paratheistic orientation of identity, which is the new term for a lot of people. In my earlier work, before I arrived at paratheistic, for anybody who's familiar with my earlier work, I had the bookmark term of other than theistic orientation of identity for this. And that was always meant as a placeholder term until I arrived at one that was suitable. And this is the one that made the cut after a lot of considerations. Paratheistic orientation of identity holds a relational affirmation which may include, but is not centrally focused upon, the religious regard of gods, in a manner which directs this theistic relationality toward matters other than and outside of concern for these gods, such as to the extent of departing from theistic lenses of consideration, utilizing these as a means to some other than theistic end. It describes one whose identity and subsequent paradigms are influentially formed by this. A paratheist is one whose identity level affirmation of and subsequent departure from central consideration of gods dramatically informs the bounds of their understanding of personhood and cosmos. So unpacking that a little bit, because that's all a mouthful, is again reiterating these are distinct from religious orientations of identity. So these do not define one's orientation of religious affiliations or practices. One can be, for example, a paratheist who is a member of a polytheist religious organization. So polytheisms are a category of religions. For example, heathenry or Kemetic polytheism, Egyptian polytheism. One's theistic orientation is about their identity, not their affiliations and practices within the greater body of their religion. I mentioned earlier that there is a polarity that exists from north to south and east to west. And those polarities are between atheistic and polytheistic orientations of identity. That polarity is one of rejection at the north and affirmation at the south. So it is basically unconditional rejection versus unconditional affirmation within theistic frameworks. And then east to west, we have centralized relationality, henotheism, and decentralized relationality, paratheism. And so again, those are rejection, affirmation, centralized to decentralized relationality. And the proposal, which is open to others engaging with this subject, just as a quick aside, I look forward to rigorous debate over the next 24 or so years of this, arbitrary number, but 24 years and then I'm done, I quit. But this is the proposal as it stands, and within this, the understanding is that an infinite array of other theistic orientations can exist within those, specifically looking at less or more rejection, less or more affirmation, more conditional or less conditional dynamics. So more henotheistic or less henotheistic, meaning that it moves the dial just like when you move around with a compass, the polarity and directional arrow moves with you. So specifically to polytheistic orientation of identity, which I've just lost because Microsoft products don't play well on Macs. There we go. Again, polytheistic orientation of identity holds a relational affirmation with religious regard of many gods who exist as genuine beings independent of human consciousness, and describes one whose identity and subsequent paradigms are influentially informed by this. The definition of polytheistic in this framework is held as an affirmation with religious regard in a wholly non-rejective and wholly non-reductive, generally additive manner. The dynamic is one of near exponential gain. It is meant to be limitlessly expansive and never full. That's sort of the entire idea of unconditional affirmation, non-rejective, non-reductive. And so as an example of orienting oneself, if somebody's theistic orientation was slightly closer to henotheism there, there exists, in fact, I've outlined, but won't go into them because that would make this a 2-hour presentation. I've outlined 3 theistic orientation proposals that exist between henotheism and polytheism. And they're hypotheticals because it is not my place to thoroughly and firmly define those groups that I'm not a part of, but the experiment of attempting came specifically from dialoguing with people who found themselves falling within that quadrant. And so they asked for my help in attempting to formulate that. So as this goes on, the question that a lot of people, especially those who are coming more from a discussion background in comparative religion or in theology or in ritual or in, honestly, the logistics of herding cats, which is so often what group religion is getting everybody together. So what does all of this matter? Why does any of this matter? And it matters because my usage of identity here is not just describing an individual's identity. It's not just describing what I myself feel or affirm or believe, but theistic orientation of identity is unique within the strata of identity orientations, in that it also in some manner defines identity itself. As a polytheist, my concept of personhood is fundamentally different than the concept of personhood that somebody who was atheistic in their theistic orientation, simply because my concept of personhood involves relation to and derivation from gods. And so this is a fundamental element of my concept of identity, not just my own, but of personhood at large. And therefore it does relate to my conception of identity validation and recognition of others, my concept of the attribution of universal human rights. I know universal is a bad word this weekend because we're at a polytheist conference, but it's what's coming to mind for me now. Human rights need to be attributed broadly and expansively. And the only method by which I know to do that is with radical personhood affirmation and identity respect. And I arrive at the places that I do, and upon the trajectory that I do, just like the sun through the sky, because of my orienting dynamics. And so somebody of a different theistic orientation is going to have some degree, whether a marginal difference or a subtle difference in nuance, of what personhood even is. Because this is looking at the fundamentals of what personhood and identity are as derived from and or belonging in relationship to gods and therefore the cosmos at large. So it matters at a global level, especially as, again, several speakers today have already addressed, moving into the 21st century, we need to decidedly stop seeing our polytheisms at both the theistic identity level and at the collective religions, the bodies of worship and practice themselves. We need to stop seeing them as vestiges of some past, which are either being reconstructed or rebuilt, or which are being sustained. We need to see them as authentic and lived and alive and vibrant. They are not of yesterday. They are not anachronisms. They are not something that we are trying to reach for or hold on to. They're tomorrow. They are the future. This is the manner in which we can see ecologically, socially, sexually, politically, economically, the future for the only future in which really any sector or lens of consideration has a chance, with unprecedented apocalyptic scenarios going on globally right now. And I'm probably over time because it's me and I do that. But in wrapping up here, I'll conclude with there's a temptation amongst those with deeply held religious identity associated with polytheistic practices or belief to call for a litmus test to enforce a false binary between theism and atheism, in which all possible theisms are reframed as polytheisms, and everything which doesn't make the cut is either wrong or atheistic. Within religious bodies, traditions, or theory, this debate is timeless and is outside the scope of this discussion here today to respond to that. It's probably enough to just recognize the existence of that discussion. And in doing so, we need to recognize the existence of distinct theistic orientations of identity held by an individual as distinct from their religious affiliations and practices, so that we can acknowledge both the existence of religious identities, and therefore, this is important, attribute rights and protections to the religious practices, because that's religion and culture, for example, are different, but they intersect. Religion and ethnos are different, but they intersect. If we're going to be talking about any of this within the context of tomorrow, then we need to start by talking about the context of the human rights violations that are happening today and which have been happening for centuries. And rights attribution need to be going to people at the collective level within the religious dynamics, but then also within those individual religions, we need to be able to recognize the distinctions between one's religious orientations of affiliation and practice and one's theistic orientations, because those are distinct, those are as distinct from one another as one's gender from one's sexual orientation. When we reference one's sexual orientation, we will often reference gender, not because gender describes their sexual orientation, but because it describes the relational attraction of sexual orientation. And similarly, when we describe theistic orientation and religious orientation as distinct from one another, we need to recognize that they are describing separate things. And both are not only distinct, but are incredibly valid, and everybody has both. Even people who are theistically and religiously atheist, they still have a theistic and a religious orientation of identity. And by expanding upon our ability to suss the nuance here in selves and others, we can recognize when we're engaged in conversations where we might be saying the same words, but are describing fundamentally different concepts. And then instead of being in conflict with one another, we can come together and find cooperative resolutions built upon and predicated around a concept of mutual respect, because presumably we all hope to wake up tomorrow. So, and tomorrow's followed by another tomorrow. We need to be able to build upon and demonstrate our ability to critically recognize these things. The complexity of identity is never going to recede. But today, more so than probably ever before, we are in a position of ability to draw forth and tease out awareness of observable distinctions of identity formation and composition, not only for the purposes of exponential gain of knowledge and nuanced, measurable, demonstrable understanding, but further toward resolving conflicts and problems through recognizing that their circular irrationality so often results from the inherent incoherence of reductive failure to acknowledge with clarity the characteristics of distinction. And
all right.
That's.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that this is, I think that this is really going to be, going forward, an indispensable framework for talking about a whole host of issues that come to the table in any discourse about religion. I think that, you know, what I see here is really a paradigm shifting approach to the entire question of religion, because on the one hand, it establishes it within an identity framework, and yet on the other hand, it posits it in relation to these axes of ontological positing of gods and similar entities. And so, although on the one hand, it gives us a new language to speak on a subjective level about the way in which religion operates in an identity context, it's not a reductionistic, subjectivizing framework. It still recognizes that this identity moment is fashioned out of ontological positings and ontological relationality, orienting oneself, as you said, with relation to certain cardinalities that one posits or counterposits, so to speak, within one's environment.